I want to describe to you two different technologies. One is the Tesla switching circuit, and the other is UFOs, because at the top of the hierarchy of their archetypal structure is the same phenomenon: two diodes in opposing directions, and the oscillations feeding that pair of diodes is from a spark gap in order to create a high frequency, and the diodes create the alternating direction, which would be there anyway, but it would not be as well defined without the pair of diodes. Anyway, because the diodes, the spark gap is like behaving like a random house filled with partiers, and they're all dancing different movements, and even though they got music playing, they're all maybe dancing to their own rhythm, and that's kind of like what happens among all the atoms in a spark gap that ionize. So we want them to get in sync with each other, and that's what the pair of diodes do, and so you get maximum power out of what otherwise might not give you any power. So let's see, what should I start with? Well, I'll start with the UFO because that's simpler, only because I know so little about it. There's a patent, came out in 2018, assigned to the Navy, that describes one view that it's a rotating magnetic field that reciprocates along its spin axis at right angles to its spin plane, and the frequencies involved are microwave. And there are other things that I can ignore because, a double hull with a gap in between, and the frequencies are bouncing around between the inner and outer shell. I don't know if that's really pertinent, because it's not what William Line says. So if we now look at William Line, he says that it's a tube of force, an AC force tube in front of your direction of travel, and a DC tube behind, to neutralize the AC tube that you are passing through as you move forward, so that you can move forward. Now, he doesn't say anything else because he doesn't know anything else. Well, it's not that hard to figure out. A homopolar disk is the key, because it'll be spinning on all the directions that are preset for the UFO to travel, and that's DC. And then if you want to go in a particular direction, one of those disks has to oscillate along its spin axis. Now, it's not that hard to make a disk oscillate. You can use pneumatic, compressed air methods, blah, blah, blah. But if you have two disks counter-rotating, and all of the DC pairs are charged. Each pair of disks is charged, but in the AC pair, they alternate which one is charged. Then that creates your reciprocation along your spin axis. And according to William Line, Tesla's special generator, the piston only had to reciprocate a 1/16 of an inch. And if you look at the documentation that Thomas Comerford Martin wrote down, because he was there, the denominator has been whited out, and in some cases, somebody actually wrote in the number 4, 1/4 of an inch. We don't know, except what William Line tells us is a 1/16 of an inch. So maybe that's the gap between the two disks. I don't know. Now, that's the basis for neutralization of inertia and gravity in the direction that you wish, inertia actually, in the direction that you wish to travel. For instance, you want to travel up to neutralize gravity, so the disk above the UFO is alternating its disks, which one is on and which one is off. And if you've got two diodes at the top of the circuitry, fueled by a discharge, a very fast, actually, you don't have to use a disruptive discharge. I'm mixing things up. The German guy, the Lockridge device, had to make use of that. But who invented quartz crystal oscillators. They came out in World War II to improve our radios over the Germans' radios, but are they a military invention or are they a Tesla invention? Tesla is already given credit by Wikipedia, which is phenomenal, it usually never happens, for inventing variable vacuum tube capacitors. But they did not become commercially available until either a year before or a year after his death. I can't remember which. And I'm sure he had customized tubes when he went to Buffalo in 1931 to install in his Pierce Arrow, and poor Peter Savo didn't know a damn thing and thought they were radio tubes. I'm sure they were custom made. In any case, if you've got a vacuum tube diode, which can then exhibit fast reaction time, all you have to do is have them face each other or face away to accentuate the oscillations between the two disks, because we have to bring it up to microwave frequencies, and I don't remember if that matches what a quartz crystal oscillator is capable of. I know a microwave oven is capable of it, so I wouldn't be surprised if Tesla figured it out and had quartz crystal oscillators at his disposal. In any case, let's see. I think that... one last thing about UFOs. And this has been bugging me ever since I got involved with Paul Falstad's simulator, because he has only ideal transformers. He does not have practical transformers. So I can use a single pole of a battery, cut off at the other pole by a switch, which might be leaking for all I know. I'm not sure how Paul's switches work. But supposedly an open circuit, so that supposedly one pole of a battery is supplying something to one side of a transformer. And because of the way I geared it, it just picks up energy and it just accumulates. It takes a while, but eventually it reaches infinite oblivion. And I called it, "Is this realistic?" And I sent it to Paul, and Paul said, "Oh, there must be something wrong." There's nothing wrong. I simply took advantage of the fact that the only type of coils that he has in his transformers are ideal coils, or ideal performance, shall we say, of transformers. Now, how do you build that sort of thing? I'm of the opinion that any simulator is buildable. Any simulated circuit is buildable. It's just a question of knowing how to translate it, because this comes from the idea of, what is it, Thevenin equivalency? You know, you can always make another version of a circuit that might be more complicated, but it'll work. It'll be the mathematical equivalent, but of course it'll have other features to it because of its change of structure. So I'm of the opinion that the same thing holds true for simulators, because it all boils down to math, and it's just a question of knowing how things work in nature. Now, there's one thing I must mention in advance. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. I better save that. Powers of 10. Hopefully I'll remember that. Okay, so I believe that this is what William Line was alluding to when he was interviewed by Paul Scarzo in the 33rd Parallel series of episodes of interviewing people that Paul did. And by the way, I read an article that he went crazy with his... he was living in Studio City, of all places. That's where I used to live. And he went nuts. Maybe his girlfriend spiked his beverage. Who knows? Maybe she just knew how to twist his buttons. But in that interview, William Line says that Tesla... they quoted... Paul reads something that was written by Tesla. I don't know what it was. I never did understand what it was, even when they were quoting it. And Tesla is saying, according to the quote, that he's switching to aluminum transformers. And William says, "Oh, see, he's going to more lightweight." Well, no, I don't think so. That's what I think ideal transformers are. Because if you listen to Jim Murray's presentation in 2013, in which he talks about his like whole life experiences working with Otis T. Carr and blah, blah, blah. He talks about a guy up in Michigan who was building a UFO, and supposedly aliens were telling him what to do, but he had absolutely no iron in his vehicle. And this is significant because whenever we think about UFOs, or when I do, it's always all aluminum. And they probably wear suits like technicians who work on the telephone line or on the power lines have to wear shorting suits to protect themselves, because the Germans during World War II, when they were playing around with their stolen Tesla technology, whether or not they stole it, they became the beneficiaries. They had UFOs, and they thought, oh, swell, we'll just put bombs in it and drop it on England, and they won't see us coming or leaving. Problem was, before they even left the ground, the electrostatic field generated by the craft self-detonated all of the ammo. Poof, no more UFO. Back to the drawing board. Oh, I might as well tell you this before I get back to aluminum transformers, because there's nothing much to say except that the core and the coils have to be aluminum. If you need that in the circuitry of a UFO, if you need a transformer in the UFO, it has to be done that way. And everything is aluminum because it's exporting its electrostatic field. And it has to switch rapidly, which also means it has to be parametrically built out of aluminum, because when you've got iron, it takes time to absorb and time to discharge. But with aluminum, nothing is absorbed, and so the switching time is increasable beyond standard measures of working with iron core transformers and copper windings. I mean, maybe they got copper windings in a UFO transformer. I don't know. But the core definitely has to be aluminum, and the coil windings probably are as well, so that the switching time can be rapid, and so that all of the magnetic field never concentrates inside the craft or the circuitry and instead is exported in the form mostly of an electrostatic field. Now, it doesn't take much strength of a magnetic field to create the neutralization of inertia. All you need is a spinning disk, homopolar disk, oscillating along its spin or reciprocating along its spin axis at right angles to its spin plane. What did I leave out? Oh, at a high enough frequency. But we don't have coils. This is not an electric motor situation. So I don't know if I've told you this before. It makes sense that the UFO has to predominate its expulsion of electrical force in the form of electrostatic, in the form of dielectric force, because that's what the job of the coils are for in an electric motor, is to build up a voltage and hold on to it. That's what we say. Reactive charge, standard conventional teaching to beginning students. The coil holds the charge, and it discharges back to the power source, and you don't get to spin that, but you have to energize the coils. Well, you don't have coils, certainly not external to the UFO, where you want the field to be, the bubble surrounding the craft and engulfing the craft inside and out. So you have to create this electrostatic field that is a bubble engulfing the craft and extended out from it a certain distance, and it has to be extremely strong electrostatic field to protect the leakage of magnetism that is going to be what creates the anti-gravity or neutralization of inertia that is going to take place as the benefit. So the magnetism is what's giving you the anti-gravity or the neutralization of inertia, but in order for it to be there at all, you got to have a very powerful electrostatic field. Now, why do I say all this? Because, oh boy, not merely because the ammo self-detonated before the Nazis took off, and the Nazi pilots, but because William Reich was arrested for this very reason, and everybody misses it. He was pointing his cloudbuster at a cloud, and he could create a cloud from a clear blue sky, or he could erase a cloud. Well, he was busy erasing the cloud, and at its center was a UFO. And the minute the cloud was gone, the UFO dropped out of the sky, fell to the ground. He, being a doctor of medicine, wanted to help save patients and victims of accidents, so he rushes to the scene. Well, somebody else rushes to the scene, and he's promptly arrested. And he's found guilty of God knows what and put into a federal prison and then assassinated or killed, if you prefer, shortly before his release. And while he's in prison, all of his books are burned. Ooh, wow. Hints of Nazi book burning. And this is after World War II in this country. So what did he do? What did he do? He ionized a pathway. You know, when a lightning strike is about to form, there's a pre-ionizing pathway that is preparing the format or the shape, the geometry of how that lightning bolt is going to be shaped. Because the air molecules pre-ionize. They prepare themselves for the lightning arc, for the voltage breakdown to eventually occur, and the lightning bolt to do its thing. Now, according to Eric, the energy feeding the damn thing is coming in at right angles to the pathway of the bolt. Be that as it may, we have an ionizing pathway, and this is all William Reich had to do, was create an ionizing pathway between the cloud and the Earth, and slowly drain that cloud of its electrostatic field, and the poor damn thing fell out of the sky because there was no electrostatic charge to protect the magnetism from losses. And so it couldn't neutralize inertia or much less gravity, and it fell. Now, of course, how does he do that? Well, William has these pipes. They're conductive pipes, metallic pipes. Anybody can get them from the hardware store. And then he has metallic conduit. Again, anybody can get that from the hardware store for shielding electrical house wiring or building wire. You can get it in plastic or you can get it in metallic. I believe it's aluminum. So he has that metallic conduit at the backside of his pipes, electrically uniting the backside of his pipes to a moving stream of water. Now, why is that important? Because this is a slow process. And the ionic charge that he's working with that he's moving is very little. His device is, you probably wouldn't even be able to measure it unless you had very, very expensive equipment to, really get in there and measure it. So he's moving charges out of that cloud way miles away in the sky at a very slow pace because he's created an ionic pathway between the cloud and his cloudbuster. And it goes along the cloudbuster, down the conduit to the moving body of water that takes the ionic charge away, because it has to, because there's not much charge there. So it has to move it out of the way rapidly in order to function at all, efficiently. And it does so. And, of course, the body of water is also grounded to the earth. So this is how he brought a UFO out of the sky, by neutralizing. Now, in chemtrail spraying, people who have researched it have discovered that they only spray when the humidity is 70% or above, and the atmosphere is positively ionized. Now, this just happens to be the lower layer of an inversion layer on a nice smoggy day in San Bernardino, or if you prefer, LA, in which the smog gets trapped because you got positive ionic charge underneath, a negative charge up above. And on a rainy day, or a smog-free day, or after a rain, that inversion layer drops to ground level, and so you only have a negative charge equal to the ground level, and so you only have clean, crisp air, because the negative charges of the Earth are charging all the particles of dust and smog and whatnot, and so they fall out of the air, and we have clean air. So in order to fly a UFO, you have to create a positively charged electrostatic field of extremely high voltage surrounding the craft and engulfing the inside of the craft throughout. And then using that as your shield, you project your magnetic field that will neutralize inertia ahead of the direction of your travel. Not bad, huh? Okay. Now, what does that have to do with Tesla's switching circuit? Well, I believe that Tesla is misguiding and misdirecting us, in which he says he's using batteries. Now, there was a guy in the 50s, according to Aaron Murakami, who managed to perfect a technique, supposedly, in his patent that does use batteries, and it's just a repeat of Tesla's. I don't know how the patent office got that past them. But did he really use batteries like the Tesla patent, or did he use some other method, same as Tesla used some other method? Batteries, according to John Bedini, take time to react. And so when watching that video you sent me, I became obvious, wow, that's slow switching time. John Bedini didn't do that. He had it switching pretty fast. In the Anthony Craddock video of John Bedini's presentation of Tesla's switching circuit, it was like half a second. And he said he managed to produce a solid-state version that was even more efficient. Anyway, regardless, I don't believe it's batteries. I believe it's capacitors. And I believe it's parametric. I like to call it alteration because it's more accurate. Everybody else says parametric excitation, parametric amplification, blah, blah, blah. Because you've got your capacitors in series, your capacitors in parallel, and unlike Chris Carson's variety of a rotating variable capacitor at higher speed of rotation, what is it, 10,000 RPM? Instead, we have something that's achievable even beyond 10,000 cycles per second, because we've got quartz crystal oscillators and counter-opposing diodes to accentuate that counter-opposition of whatever frequency we're feeding through a circuit of one type or another. Now, what does that have to do with switching sides of the two capacitor banks? Because we have to think, okay, how did Tesla do it? He didn't have... Oh, a little backup here. The SERPS device of Jim Murray and Paul Babcock is Tesla's switching circuit. They're hiding it. They didn't want to tell us. But they did admit to the fact that there are two banks of capacitors and a resistive load in between, and it has to be a resistive load. Well, when you're dealing with capacitors, it has to be a resistive load. When John Bedini did his Anthony Craddock video, what did he do? He had diodes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in between. You could have anything if you're dealing with batteries, because the rate of oscillation is so slow. You could have inductors for all anybody cares. But if you're going at high speed, it's got to be an incandescent light bulb or something similar. Now, what I think is happening is that the accentuation of switching at the top of the circuit is counter-opposing diodes run by an oscillating quartz crystal oscillator. But we want more accentuation of amplitude than what that will provide. And I'm guessing that it's similar to the type of circuit, I forget what they're called, you'd know, when an ion generator of one kind or another, negative or positive ozone, they use a series of diagonals and whatnot, capacitors and diodes to build up voltage. Now, when we take a lesson from Eric Dollar's analog computer, either in LMD mode or TEM mode, the only difference between the two is 90 degrees rotation. So I'll venture a guess that that's all that's needed in the case of these voltage build-up schemes that can create high voltage, low current situations and thus create negative ions or ozone, whatever it is you want to create, in which we have to switch direction between how we connect with that module that's either going to be parallel or in series. So when it's in series, it's building up voltage, but when it's in parallel, it's going to be doing the opposite. It's going to be releasing the voltage, for one thing, but under different conditions, under opposite. So I guess that's a two-phase system. See, I thought it has to be four-phase, because I can't remember how the switching circuit works that John Bedini showed off to Anthony Craddock and his wife. But when looked at in this fashion, it becomes obvious, to me anyway, not schooled in this stuff, that it's a two-phase operation, two half cycles to the full cycle. There's no 4 quarter cycles. But I don't know. Because you still have to do it parametrically, which means it still has to be quarter phases. quarter phases of a cycle. In any case, whatever. You'd know. You'd be able to figure it out. I'm doing all this in my head. So I'm a little limited. And I don't have building experience, and I don't have a simulator in front of me. I can't do nothing except use whatever training I've had over the last 6 to 7 years and use my brain. Because at this point, being homeless since August, that's all I can do. I mean, sometimes I draw pictures on paper, but I don't have paper and I don't have a pencil or a pen. Well, I think I might have no, I don't even have a pen. So I'm really hard up here. So I have to do everything in my head, so I can only do so much. But that's what I'm wondering, because it's just so obvious. I mean, to me, it's so obvious. I mean, anybody who passes through Aaron Murakami is going to write up their presentation no differently than a patent, in which there's going to be misguidance, of one sort or another, falsification, information left out of the picture, enough to get us watering, salivating. And that's about it. Appeal to emotion. That's, the height of the epitome of the Piscean age. Every age reaches its epitome and then collapses. It doesn't peak in the middle. It reaches its peak at the very end, just before it collapses. Meanwhile, when the next age, is dispensatory age, comes into force, it's growing gradually, but it's overshadowed by the prior age until the prior age collapses. And so that's what these conventions appeal to, people's emotions. I went for empathy. Once I gain rapport with people's consciousness, I gain their source. Because a source of inspiration, whether you're a musician or an artist or a scientist, is a very specific pathway towards God. And if you don't have that, if you're not in touch with that pathway, you don't have access to what that pathway can afford you. But knowing how these things work, all I had to do was show up and be clueless, which I was, and gain rapport with the presenters. And this is why I'm so disgusted with Peter, because I gained rapport with him. And this is not the first time I've disgusted him. I've already stole his P-gun dimensions for his rainmaking that he gave to Trevor Constable by figuring it out. And when I told him about it by email, he blew the roof. I didn't tell you that. You can't say I told you that. Well, did I? I'm telling you, I figured it out. Duh. I mean, shit. I wonder how much intelligence that guy has. But he appeals to emotion. He just kicks into emotion. So he'd be a better musician or an artist than he would be a scientist. Anyway, you figured that out by now. So he appeals to the emotions in the crowd. Anyway. So this is not the first time I've crossed paths with him, and I don't care. I don't give a shit. Anybody who keeps secrets is not a game plan in my book, because this is the Aquarian age we're moving into. There's not going to be any money. There's not going to be any institutions. Everything's going to collapse. And according to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, within 1 year, because he told a TM teacher who asked him, so when is this Age of Enlightenment supposed to come in full force that you keep saying is going to happen? Well, between 2020 and 2025, depending on world consciousness. Well, so far it hasn't happened. I haven't seen it happen, unless you're seeing the world differently than me. Instead, things just keep getting worse. And Charlie Lutz said it'll keep getting worse, until the people who are making it worse suddenly disappear. And my intuition is it'll take about 3 or 4 years to depopulate the Earth and get it down to a fraction, less than 10% of its current population. Far less. Be that as it may. And I'm going to be running when I first moved to Ramona, and then when I moved to Poway, I had these premonitions, visions, just like Tesla, visions projected out in front of me in the waking state. I hated it. Oh, did I hate them. Because building after building after building after building after building after building will be empty and will have to be bulldozed because there won't be anybody to live in them. Now I'm thinking there'll be corpses instead. But regardless, wherever the bodies are laid, strewn around, if there are any, I don't know. Maybe they'll all vaporize. Maybe they'll be attacked by specialized superbugs and super duper turn them into dust in record time and carbon dioxide gas, whatever. I don't know. But they were, and so I'm thinking to myself, no, wait a second. The only reason why I ever have premonitions for any reason is because I'm already involved. Oh shit, I'm going to be driving the bulldozers. Oh no. And that's what came to me once I decided to think about it, and I'll use a little logic for a change. That's the consequence. Why am I having these visions? Oh my God. Oh, yuck. See, this is the burden of being clairvoyant. For 1,300 years. Oh, God. Supposedly I've gotten used to it. No, on occasion it still throws me for a loop. Other times it's like, okay, whatever. But sometimes it's not so pleasant. Sometimes it's ridiculously upsetting. Okay. Sometimes it's suicidal. But fortunately, I don't go there. I haven't yet. Thank God. I've come pretty close. I feel like sometimes I'm like Zarathustra and I'm ready to give up and go back to my mountain peak, and these people aren't worth it, Moses had a change of heart. No, don't destroy them just because I broke the tablets. No. Oh, okay. If you insist, then I'll give you another set of tablets. But Zarathustra, he just plain gave up. He didn't give his people a second chance. Oh, God. But they didn't commit suicide. Anyway, so that does it for UFOs, what little I know. But that's a lot more than I knew 4 years ago when I first started applying my attention to the matter. Now, the patent in question that is assigned to the Navy was 2018. I mirrored it on my website. I don't remember where. You could try various folders. You could try vinyasi.info/energy. I'm not sure where else. There is a place, well, I don't want, it's complicated, so I don't want to describe it, but that would be the first place I'd advise going to look for it. Or you do the easy Google way. Site, vinyasi.info, space. Oh, darn. The next thing would have to be the patent number. Well, you'd have better luck looking on the internet because there is a webpage devoted to it. And the movie called Explorers with a very young Ethan Hawke and River Phoenix in their very first feature film, the two of them. And the webpage points out the fact, I keep coming up with more stuff, points out the fact that River Phoenix's character, the scriptwriter, put in the character, in River Phoenix's mouth, the German term for the neutralization of inertia. Now, his parents are made to be Germans. But the author of the webpage is going, what the fuck? This is a children's movie. What are we using German phrases? How many Germans are going to be in the audience? Oh, there'll be some. But how many are going to know the term for the neutralization of inertia unless you're also into physics? And you're a kid. Unless you're the parents of the kid watching along. Or the scriptwriter knew about William Lyne's dissertation. Because he went to the junkyards and he found master compasses, slave compasses, written in German in junkyards in New Mexico, so, where he met with Werner von Braun between 36 and 38 to tutor him on the stolen technology, the arson of 1895 that was intended to hide the theft. Regardless of who did the thievery, the Germans ended up with it. And they didn't know how to deal with all of it, They still didn't know. So they sent Werner over to ask Tesla, how do you deal with this stuff? Anyway. Now I think that seals the deal on UFOs. Now, getting back to the switching circuit. So I already started. Okay. So Jim Murray and Paul Babcock are already doing it in the SERPS technology, but they're using modern-day technology for the rapid switching. How did Tesla do it? Because he didn't have those shit. Well, he used diodes. Now, Aaron admits in one of his presentations, I don't remember which, it might have been the Plasma Ignition Secrets, or Ignition Secrets, I should say, in which he claims that initially, before a diode blocks current, It actually allows it to pass. It's like a really, 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 really teeny-weeny fraction of a second, but it does happen. So already right there you're getting switching. And if you switch the diodes using, your counter-opposing diodes or counter-facing away diodes, whatever they are, using a frequency that matches the duration or the half cycle, matches the duration of that momentary allowance of current to come out of a blocking diode. Whoopsie-doodle. Now we've got the accentuation of voltage buildup accommodated by diodes that are actually not blocking it. Oops. They're actually letting it pass. Oops. Hint, hint. I never thought of that till now. Pays to talk out loud to yourself. So, that might be the only reason why they have to go to microwave frequencies, because that might be, the half cycle of a microwave frequency might be the duration of what Aaron has described. I don't know. I don't know if he qualifies how long that duration is. I can't remember. But he said it was very short. Anyway. Let's see, where am I? Now, I'm not sure I mentioned that the reason for ideal transformers being ideal is because they're made out of aluminum, because they paramagnetically export all of their force as electrostatic charge, because we're not trying to transmit voice that uses iron at a slower frequency. I think I mentioned that, but I just want to make sure. So we're using high frequency, and we're not dealing with sine waves necessarily, at least not clean ones, because we're just doing a UFO. But in a switching circuit, in which the load has to be a resistive load of incandescent light bulbs, not LEDs, as Peter loves to quirp about, then it kind of gives it away that we're dealing with a very disruptive circuit. Nothing nice about it. Dirty electricity in its lack of harmony. Because if we're thinking like Tesla, using Tesla's available materials or technology of components back in the day, yeah, it kind of limits someone. You got to use diodes, and that's it. And it just works out. If it's a vacuum tube diode, then it should work just fine. Now, I'm not clear on whether or not anybody makes them, but it can't be that hard. One lead is aluminum, and the other lead is something else. And whether it's a full vacuum or a partial vacuum, I don't know. That would be something to look at. Now, I ran across, Amazon has issues with some of my publications. I raised the price on many of them, and that gave them a chance to review them and say, hey, wait a second, you got a copyright violation here, blah, blah, blah. So one of the things I said in one of those books, The Heaviside Solution to the Ferranti or Ferranti effect, I don't know Italian words, how you pronounce them, Italian names, Ferranti effect. One of the pages in there, I say that there are two different ways to alter the equivalent series resistance of a capacitor. One way is to pressurize it, and this is what Byron Brubaker claims, because there is a patent that's available that's not sequestered and made top secret that has to do with the manufacturing of capacitors under pressure. Well, what about operating them under pressure? This is what Byron Brubaker thinks the only reason why Tesla asked Peter Savaro to come along was because he had a pressure gauge on the dashboard, and he needed Peter to keep his eyeball screwed on there, especially in the beginning, to make sure that the circuit was stable and didn't blow something, because something was being pressurized. Well, lately I've been postulating the thought to myself that the opposite may be the case. It might be a vacuum. And seeing this quote from this book today, that's exactly... my memory must be kicking in, because there are two ways to get a change, an alteration of equivalent series resistance in a capacitor. One is to raise its pressure with respect to all the other components in the circuit. The other way is to pressurize everything else and leave the capacitor in question at ambient atmospheric pressures. Or do the opposite. Hey, if you got a vacuum pump, why not just suck it out of that capacitor and send it to everything else? Or the opposite, do it the other way. Either way, whatever you like. Whichever way works best. And this changes, when you change the equivalent series resistance of a capacitor under simulation, some interesting things happen. Very interesting things happen. Now, why am I bringing that up? Because it may be part of Tesla's switching circuit if we replace the batteries with capacitors. He may be monkeying with their pressure or selecting which capacitors he's using, because you can't change pressure very rapidly. So it would have to be banks of capacitors that are either depressurized or pressurized. And that's another element. Could create more cycles. Could create an eighth cycle. An eighth phase is eighth phases to your cycle instead of quarter phase or half phase. In any case, regardless, is an intriguing idea, just for whatever it's worth. But I think this is how it works. And I think the Spanish guy who came up with a revival of the Tesla switching circuit, and Jim Murray and Paul Babcock, all three are doing it the same way and do not have batteries. Now, John Bedini showed us batteries, and it was still only half a second in half a cycle time, I believe, unless it was half a second for the full cycle time, but whatever. It was somewhere around in there, as I recall, because that's as much as you can squeeze out of a battery. But is he trying also to hide the truth and hope that maybe one of us gets it, that you can increase frequency now by using capacitors to replace the batteries now? In all of my training on simulators, I've had it screwed into my brain that the potential energy of electrical reactance is manipulatable without any cost of energy per se to speak of. And the benefit is the expansion or the contraction of the amplitude of kinetic energy, amps and volts. Just like Ant-Man in Marvel Comics, no different. Because energy, as far as electricity is concerned, is not energy, it's information. No energy leaves, no energy enters a circuit. Only information does that. And it's true we use peer pressure when we apply full voltage plus a little extra to spare for our so-called input voltage. But that's just like the way we manufacture permanent magnets. We use a strong magnetic field, we heat up the bar of iron, and everything realigns itself in the same direction, and then we bring it back down in temperature to ambient room temperature, and then we release the magnetic field, and now we've got a bar magnet. We didn't put any energy in that bar magnet, but electricity works exactly the same way. We never put electricity into a circuit. We simply get to change its behavior over time. Well, if the circuit can do that on its own because we've made a smart circuit instead of a dumb flashlight circuit, voila, we have free energy. Because it's not energy that is free, it's information. You know, if you ever take a look, and I'm sure you've already seen it, Magnetic Currents, the video by Eric Lathwaite, done in the 70s at the college that he taught at, he shows how it's merely information that moves the ball along. The rods are going up and down, and the ball is moving sideways. That's how a cam drive works. Be that as it may, it's the translation of information that makes that possible. To translate reciprocating motion into rotary motion, it's simply information. The geometry of information. Now, we'd call it mechanical engineering, okay, whatever. But the translation itself is not energy. It's information, strictly speaking. And that's the magic of the thing. Looking at Eric Lathwaite's, the whole thing, magnetic currents, he's got a linear magnetic lineup of electromagnets, and he's zipping a piece of I think it's aluminum or something, and it hits it's a lot of force. And all because the ripple of the domino effect that he's creating is happening so fast that the metal piece moves rapidly. It's not energy that gets that metal piece to move rapidly. It's the ripple or the pattern of the sequencing of magnetic fields as they increase and decrease from one electromagnet to the next that causes that metal to move so fast because he's switching them so rapidly and in the right pattern to create a ripple effect. So, and then when people stand, this is the best analogy of all. If you don't like any of those, if anybody doesn't like those, people standing up and raising their arms and sitting down and lowering their arms in a field, football, soccer field, creating what's called a Mexican wave. Nobody has to touch their neighbor, much less run around the stadium. And yet, from a distance, it looks like something is traveling around the stadium. Pretty fast, too. It's all an illusion. And that's what a lot of electrical engineering is. It's an illusion, a macroscopic illusion happening at a microscopic level. Anyway. So to me, this is why it's possible to use the properties of capacitance, inductance, frequency, duration, and the consequential phase relations to modify kinetic energy, because the kinetic energy is not energy anyway. If it were radioactive fallout emanating from uranium, causing the uranium to lose mass as it switches its atomic number downwards, okay, fine. Except, if we can redefine the neutralization of inertia, and for that matter mass, and gravity, by using electrical processes in a UFO, there's not much left to redefining nuclear physics strictly in terms of electrical engineering principles. I'm not there yet, but it sure is moving in that. If I live long enough, maybe I'll live to see somebody else do it, if not me. But my awareness certainly is moving in that direction. But until that happens, I have to still sequester nuclear physics and E equals mc squared as the only version of energy, so-called, that exists in creation, and instead view electrical energy as strictly information alone. Nothing else to it but that. Because coils don't lose their mass when they're running. They do heat up, but they don't lose their mass. They do get cool when it's a free energy circuit, and you might even get ice over the engine block of Leroy K. Rogers in Iona, Florida, who created a method by which a gasoline engine minus its carburetor and fuel can be supplied with compressed air at a rate fast enough to run it on strictly compressed air alone, because an explosion of gasoline is nothing more than a compressed vapor being exploded into a cylinder from its liquid state. It's, what do they call it? Flash distillation, similar to the ignition of gasoline. So he figured on the same process, but he had to figure out how to compress the air fast enough. And he said, at the time, this is 43 years ago when I first read about it in publications, you'd get them in the back of Popular Mechanics or whatever and send away for it and find out about, free energy, wow. And I thought, he doesn't need my help. He's got it in the bag. Well, no, we have yet to see it commercialized. Oh, shit. I could have, instead of being wasting my time, running around wasting my time, I could have helped out, but I didn't. So even then, it was reported that the engine block iced up with a very thin layer of ice as it ran, which tells me something, that the phase relation between temperature and pressure he's monkeying with in order to gain an advantage. So I thought 43 years ago, maybe he's using a Stirling cycle engine to pre-chill the air to make it easier to compress it so it'll collapse very readily and undergo liquefaction. And then all he has to do is flash distill it under a slight vacuum to get it to boil, to get it to depressurize very rapidly and turn into vapor and shove that piston like crazy. that was the way I conceptualized it at the time. It may still be valid because it creates a layer of ice on the engine block. So something with temperature is going on here. But Leroy, why am I bringing him up? Holy shit, I forgot. I'll have to listen to this recording and maybe join another recording to it. There was another story regarding him. The three automakers came at him with $1 billion offer. They joined up and made him $1 billion offer after he had already gone to each one separately, and they turned him down. And so I thought, this is fishy. They're going to shelve the damn thing. I'm going to have to just sell it myself. So when I looked him up back in 2008-ish, I found a guy by his name living in Iona, Florida, a truck driver. So, don't quit your day job. Don't stop pouring cement. But he's now done 3 different patents to his credit. At that time, 43 years ago, there was only 1 patent, I believe. But now he's got 2 more. And the latest one is 2018. Must be a hot year between Jim Murray and Paul Babcock and Leroy K. Rogers. 2018 must have been a hot year. Did we have more solar activity? I can't remember. Eric Dollard said when the peak was at this last Zoom conference, but whatever. Let's see. What else did I overlook? Yeah, I can't remember why I brought up Leroy K. Rogers. I can't remember his middle initial. Right. Coils. So, what does that have to do with the switching circuit? Absolutely nothing. Oh, I see. Yes. See, the real testimonial to free energy is really when we smelt, when we purify the metals that we are going to use for conductive purposes. Because, let's say it's copper sulfate. The energy, if we want to talk about energy, the energy is there, and the sulfate ion is taken away from the copper. The copper is depleted. So it joins hands, arm in arm, links elbows with all the other copper atoms and creates a solid mass of copper, whereas copper sulfate, you can grind it down to a powder. But the copper joins hands because of the paucity of energy in its valence electron shells. And so it's starved for energy. So it's the nature of electricity, of electrical components that we utilize for our circuits to give us free energy if we make use of it. But we suppress it on the presumption that we have to give it the full amount plus extra. And so it never gets to sing its true nature, which is the Big Bang, which is code term for the essential nature of electricity is a wild stallion. It wants to do as it pleases, when it wants to do it, in the manner that it does it, without warning you in advance. In other words, a Big Bang. That's what Big Bang refers to. And photons are packets of information. That's why they're massless. All these terminology that physicists made up, which I really believe they were lawyers to hide the truth. Let's see what else. So, it's only when we form the metal that an exothermic reaction occurs. When we run a free energy circuit, it's endothermic. It wants to suck electrical energy from its environment, or which could be nature or power transmission lines. Moray, they claimed he always ran his device near a power line. And I've seen it under simulation. It's, wow. Talk about a pump, like a heat pump, that can move heat around. A reactive pump is unbelievable what it can move off of a power line very, very, very far away. We're talking, at least under simulation, multiple digits of place value to the right of the decimal point in terms of the magnetic coupling between the coil that's doing the stealing and the power line that has all the voltage. We're talking like quite a distance. Now, my intuition tells me 50 feet is the limit. And the only reason why the Amon brothers claimed 10 miles was because they were piggybacking onto the electric utility grid along with house wiring and building wiring. So they had to have their device within 50 feet of a power line. Well, it's not that hard. You're driving around the streets of Denver, of course you're going to be within 50 feet of a power line, especially if you're on the right side of the road, right up against the curb. I mean, it was kind of left out of the newspaper article, but be that as it may, whatever. So 50 feet is the limit for this type of phenomenon to occur, regardless, because, simulators are not accurate, but they do hint, and that's why I wish people would pay more attention to simulators, because they do hint at possibilities. Even though they're not accurate, who gives a shit? We should be investigating all these anomalies, but we don't. Anyway, at least I do. At least their design characteristics. I haven't built anything yet, except psionic circuits such as Peter Lindemann's P-gun. And I managed to make rain, but I had help from a yogi, so I didn't do it all alone. But it's on my earthinglife.info website on page 3 or 4. Photo documentation, and I brought about rain in 6 days' time. With a P-gun hooked up to a Leon Ernest Demons biocircuit with myself in the circuit. Peter Lindemann was really furious with me. Don't you mess with that. You're going to mess it. You could kill yourself or hurt yourself. Well, yeah, duh, I have. But I've also figured out by trial and error how to do things correctly. So how else am I going to figure it out? I got to experiment. And I got to use my body because that's the way I wanted to do it. So I figured out how to make my body part of the circuit, and I managed to create a hole in a chemtrail cloud that covered the L.A. San Fernando Valley sky from horizon to horizon. They had been spraying all day from morning until afternoon. Last I saw it in the morning, I took a bus at 9 in the morning, and then I came out of my little hovel at a TM ashram, shall we say, jacking up my vibrations over a period of 6 hours. So by 3 in the afternoon, the sky was thick with a chemtrail mist. And in 45 minutes session of my little rainmaking circuit, I bore a hole through it directly above the hotel where I was stationed at, with a counterarm, like a Milky Way counterarm wisp of chemtrail wisp in the center with its two arms. I forget which direction. You'll have to look at the pictures to find out. I can't remember. And in 6 days' time, a humongous rain front crossed the Pacific coast, stretching up into Canada and down into Mexico and throughout the west coast of the United States. Humongous rain clouds. 6 days it took, but it did it. So I thought, okay, that's pretty good. And I moved on to other things. Because who's interested, you know? By the way, the P-gun is a bore, an inner diameter relative to its length. So its bore diameter versus its length, or I should say the length versus the bore diameter, is the square root of 2 times the 5th power of 2. That is it in full glory. But the P-gun is a quarter wavelength, so he cut it down to a quarter length, and it works just as well. And it has a convex mirror on the inside facing inwardly towards the opposite open end. And it has orgone blanket wrapping around it, including covering the so-called open end. And then it has an iron wire going down the inner side of that bore, taped to the inside, which connects that to the biocircuit that you get into, which has to be iron, floral, insulated wire, not copper. And the mirror end is the head. It represents a human. And the open end, so-called, is the crotch, in which the head is positive, the crotch is negative. And you hook it up to the biocircuit by reverse polarization, so that the negative term, you break the biocircuit so that you've now got two terminals that are broken at the break. One is positive and one is negative, because they go to those chakras of the body that are positive versus negative, because you combine them to create a calming circuit experience. But you break that and you put the rainmaking tube circuit in there so that the positive of the biocircuit is going to the crotch, the open end of the rainmaking tube. It has to go to the opposite. And you point the rainmaking tube straight up. You don't put it at an angle because then you lose the ability. Because Trevor Constable did an experiment in front of some college students in which he pointed his Wilhelm Reich cloud-making set of tubes straight up, and he created a fog right where they were standing, nowhere else. Because the influence went up and came straight back down again. And that's how I learned how to use the darn thing, because I couldn't move it through or against a moving etheric wavefront, hooked up to the strut of a single-engine plane or the foot of a helicopter moving at, I don't know what the nautical mileage is, but when translated into car mileage, it's 60 miles an hour for 60 minutes in the same direction, constantly. Constant speed, constant direction for 60 minutes. But I couldn't do that, so I just pointed it straight up, and I got the influence straight down, but it pulled a wavefront into California. And I'd clear up to Canada and down into Mexico. So I've really only built circuits that are psionic. Eamon, but I have taken Eric Dollard's analog computer as a point of inspiration to create synchronicity using parallel capacitance, not series capacitance, to create synchronicity among the lines of a Leon Ernest Eamon circuitry, biocircuitry, so that all the chakras of the body can align themselves in their charge and discharge cycles to get perfect alignment, and that actually, or to boost alignment, and that actually boosts the experience. Boy, up into the celestial cosmos. Oh my God. I mean, you get deep sleep, suppressed dreams, no dreams whatsoever, the sleep of a hibernating animal, exactly the same as them, deeper than what we go through. And if you're caught up on your sleep, then you remain awake. And if you're familiar with that state during meditation, samadhi, I had 2.5 hours of samadhi induced by a biocircuitry incorporating parallel capacitance to get things to line up. All the lines, the 8 lines, because I used all 8 chakras, or 4 lines, I used all 8 chakras in Leon Ernest Eamon's mapping of the physiology. He says, don't bother with the legs and the ears. You don't need to. Are you kidding? The legs are the most powerful exit point of life force of the entire physiology, not the hands. It's the bottom of the feet. That's why when you get into full lotus, you can sense it going into your gut, improving digestion, if you can get into a full lotus, which I used to be able to do when I was a kid. Immediately my digestion improved, and I have poor digestion. I was born that way. So I could see, wow, these feet are powerful. So you include the feet in the circuit, matching up the right foot to the right ear, because everything above the neck is switched laterally, and the left foot or left ankle to the left ear. And then, of course, right hand goes to crotch if you're right-handed, and left hand goes to throat. So using all 4 lines and only breaking one of them to put in the rain-making tube, I managed to make rain. But when it comes to parallel capacitance, that was a separate experiment. I had to incorporate all 4 lines in 2 stacks of capacitor plates, alternating with dielectrics in between them. I used glass plates and I think it was wax paper in between. No. Some of my plates I covered with aluminum foil on both sides. Those were my conductive plates. And some of them I just used bare glass plates for the dielectric. And so I sandwiched them alternately, creating stacks of a dozen in each stack, 2 stacks. And I think you can do a 1-stack version or a 4-stack. You can do them in multiples of 2, I believe. And 6, 8. But you zigzag between them, and that creates the parallel capacitance, while at the same time it does not break your connection, your throughput. And it gets the 2 lines. You choose 2 lines out of your 4 lines that you want to synchronize, and it gets them synchronized, because eventually they go through both stacks. Everything out of either line. And so they have to capacitively, dielectrically synchronize their charge and discharging cycles. And that gets the body into I could have put it on the other 2 lines, but I never bothered to. Had them on all 4 lines. I could have. Yeah, I could have had a 4-stack system or whatever. I think it's possible to do any number of alternations, and then you can create any number of stacks you want. A 1-stack system, a 2-stack system. They just have to be in even numbers. Anyway, so I've given you several inventions here. More than 1 or 2. Because that's the way my mind works. I'm just sorry to say. People hate it. I think I've covered the switching circuit as much as I can because that's the essence of it. It's parametric. We're changing the capacitance by changing whether or not the capacitor bank is in series or in parallel, depending on switching back and forth and how we do the switching. But it's the only thing that makes sense because now we can, now I remember why I brought in this business, frequency. So you have to increase frequency. This is how Joseph Newman's motor works, is because of Byron Brubaker's suggestion to him that added to his square wave that was slow frequency, a very high sine wave emanating out of the molecules of helium inside the canisters that he made everybody believe were permanent magnets, but they were not. They were PVC sewage pipe canisters filled with helium, surrounded by an open coil on the exterior of the canister with helium on the interior, and by rotating them, having a changing electrostatic field, because his copper coil, that's all it did, had very thin wire, very humongous number of turns, very large coil, creating mostly an electrostatic field. So when you get a noble gas, it responds only to a changing electrostatic field, but as the result, it creates an electromagnetic field. Maybe this has something to do with UFOs. And that's where you get the humongous amount of current that mostly goes to waste. But in the case of a switching circuit powered by helium or neon that's excited in the plasma state, you get a very rapid set of vibrations of alternating frequency. And this is what powers Joseph Newman's motor and makes it over unity. Otherwise, it wouldn't be. It can't be. It's impossible. Making it bigger doesn't work. Making its capacitances more doesn't work. I tried everything. Only frequency. So the only way you're going to increase frequency in a Tesla switching circuit to get over unity is to not deal with slow-acting batteries. This is why I say it has to be capacitors. It cannot be done any other way to get over unity. That's why you came close, but you'll never reach over unity unless you switch over to capacitors. Now, originally, I was going to say in my recording to you here that you only replace one battery with a capacitor in your 2 banks. Maybe that's the way it's done. I don't know. But then I thought to myself, so wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. They all replace with capacitors. And then you can increase the frequency. See? That's the reason. Now, that might be how Leroy Rogers improved his efficiency, because his engine stalled, or his compressor stalled, when he drove less than 20 miles an hour. That was 43 years ago. He's probably figured out how to increase the frequency so that he can increase his output of air to accommodate the lower efficiency of driving at a slower speed. Because I don't think gears alone will be enough to do the job. Be that as it may, frequency matters. Sometimes that's all it takes, is to increase frequency without changing anything else. It was the case with Joseph Newman. Between his demonstration model and the model that he told everybody to build. And I believe that's what the Tesla switch amounts to, is you increase frequency. However you do it, you got to do it. Because that's the only way you're going to get over unity. No matter what else. Now, you've done a lot of other things, and that's good. That puts you ahead of everyone else. But you're still not going to get over unity unless you ramp up the frequency. So, with that in mind, I shall now shut up. Ooh. Now, there's another thing you should know. In MicroCap 12 Simulator, in the help file, they say that the purpose of a capacitor is to act as a shock absorber. I beg to differ. And then they go on to say because of that, the capacitor has to have adequate capacitance to do its job. Otherwise, if it goes too low, you're going to get, and I forget the word they use, we'll just call it anomalies and leave it at that, okay? Oh, we're not supposed to get those. Well, what happens when you lower the capacitance below 1 picofarad? Because that's the lowest one you'll find off the shelf for purchase availability. And how hard is it to make less than that? You're just stringing a bunch of 1 picofarad capacitors all in series. Well, you get an interesting anomaly, and this is what happens. If you look up the dielectric properties of the various substances that you can use in a capacitor, and you look up the prismatic properties of various substances used to construct various prisms, you find out that mathematically they have a direct correlation. One is the square of the other versus the square root. I forget which is which, but it's an exact mathematical relationship. Thus, my theory of what happens under extremely low capacitance, because what I was seeing happening under simulation was that there was an increase of frequency, but going in opposite directions. Because half of the parent wave passed through the dielectric of the capacitor and the other half bounced off. Why? Because none of it gets absorbed. The capacitor no longer absorbs below 1 picofarad, apparently. That's why nobody sells it that way. Instead, it does a combination of refraction and reflection. Now, this is significant because, as it turns out, the increase of frequency of these daughter waves zipping around in opposite directions, we are more than rewarded because we now have opposing waves. See, I always wondered, how do you get a wave to oppose itself? You know, how do you get the amperage to oppose the voltage, to create the classic over unity situation of the generation of current? Negative watts, or as Jim Murray likes to say in the patent of the SERPS technology, reactive watts, he likes to call it. Fine, call it reactive watts, but it's negative watts. We've taken the square root of a negative value under the radical of a square root and squared it in the course of doing electrical engineering computations. And now that liberates that imaginary number, and it becomes reactive watts, negative watts, whatever you want to call it, the generation of power coming from the circuit itself. So, how does that happen? How do we get the thing to reverse itself? Well, forgetting imaginary numbers for the moment, because I used to think, well, that's the only way it can be done. The other way is to get a very low-level capacitance. And now you've got two daughter waves going in opposite directions in sync with each other. If the pathway they take, the conductive, or if you prefer to call it inductive pathway that they take along conductive medium, such as wire or coils, is exactly the same, matched. Now, that may not be true, because I've done circuit simulations in which I thought, hey, what if I slightly deviate the inductance on both sides, or the capacitance? Because very often I have to do things in pairs in order to get parametric alteration. And if I deviate it slightly, I actually improve efficiency, and I get more over unity than I would have otherwise if I made them exactly the same. And of course, in the real world, things are always slightly deviant. Anyway, so what was the point of this recording? Oh shit, I forgot already. So, consequently, what if the bank of capacitors that Jim Murray and Paul Babcock utilize, when they're hooked up in series, gives you a total capacitance that's less than a picofarad? Because this kind of phenomenon of prismatic refraction of electrical energy going through the dielectric only happens under extreme conditions way below standard conventional wisdom. It doesn't happen under extreme, the opposite direction of supercapacitances. It only happens under extremely low capacitances. Like a plate of glass, that you might use for your window. Something nice and thick. So that might be a telling indication of where their range is located when they switch between series versus parallel capacitances. Now, when I did my simulations under Paul Falstad's simulator, I got completely different criteria. But then his simulator is not very similar to conventional real world anyway. It takes a little tweaking to figure out how to translate his capacitors and coils and whatnot into the transformer coils into the real world. Not his single inductors, but his transformer coil inductors. But his capacitors are pretty wild too. So I found that I have to alter the capacitance of a single capacitor, and this might be where the problem lies. I didn't use two or more. Well, there's my problem right there. But using a single capacitor, my minimum capacitance had to be like 10 millifarads, and then it had to very suddenly shift up to 10 farads, 1,000 to 1 difference. And every time I did that, first the current would magnify, and then followed by the voltage magnifying. Only 1/2 of wattage would magnify at one time. The other half would depreciate, but only slightly, while the other half of Ohm's law magnified quite significantly. And thus, half baby step by half baby step, I could get the wattage up by simply changing the capacitance up and down, up and down, up and down of a single capacitor. Now, in Jim Murray's transforming generator, he says that it's the capacitances between the two coils, the stationary coils on either side of his rotating coil. This is the generator now, not the motor that drives it. But it's the mutual capacitance among those stationary coils relative to the rotating coils inside that create a parametric situation. He actually said that during his presentation back in, 2015 or whatever it was. So this is, I think, what we have to look for in Tesla's switching circuit, is a parametric alteration of the components involved. And it's usually done in two minimum of each type, like two minimum capacitors, two minimum coils. You can have more, although the efficiency of adding more drops off, so there is a limit to how many more you want. Usually with coils, if they're very small inductances, I think 8 or 9 is the max. When they're large inductances, 2 or 3, somewhere around in there. But it has to be 2 minimum. And this is a nice thing about simulators. Despite their limitations, they do give the opportunity for parametric excitation when the components are in pairs. The types of components are in pairs or more than pairs. Because I suspect they are computing the field effect somehow. Because it's the fields, I imagine, that are modifying each other's fields. You know, it might be the dielectric field, or it might be the magnetic field of coils, or the dielectric field of capacitors. I suspect it's the only way it can happen, because the capacitance of the capacitor is fixed. So how the hell is it doing what it's doing? Because it's modifying the field of its partner coil, or its partner capacitor, and vice versa. Let's see, what else? Oh, I forgot already what this recording was about already. Oh, yeah, prisms, yeah. So I'm not saying anything new, so I think I'll just terminate this and put them all together and convert it to MP3, MP3. Because, that's a very interesting thing, and because of that, that's the explanation as to why we're not sold capacitances less than 1 picofarad. God forbid we should stumble across free energy circuits, because they become prismatic. And energy actually passes through what normally we say, oh, it's displacement current. Not when the capacitance gets low enough. It ain't displacement current anymore. It's something else. Because the wave refracts through the prismatic material of the... Now, all right. If I have to concede, okay. But see, the capacitor is not storing anything anymore. It's literally, it bounces off of it And this is the only way sometimes to get the simultaneous manifestation of the reversal of amperage relative to volts is by using extremely low capacitances in conjunction with quite hefty inductors, like, 10 Henry inductors versus, the capacitances are like 100 femto, like a tenth of a picofarad. If you put one in series on either side of an inductor, a 10 Henry inductor, that's a great way to start the ball rolling in an over-unity circuit in some cases. Because those capacitors can't store, so they can't absorb, so there's no time lag. Because there's two of them, and they're each on the two terminals of a coil of very large inductance. Now we get a prismatic effect in addition to a reflectivity that causes the reversal of the polarity of either amps or volts, I don't know which, but only one of them, and now we get negative watts or reactive watts, as Jim Murray likes to call it. So it's really an interesting phenomenon, to put it mildly. And you do need coils to manifest it. You use the capacitors to set things up. That's the way I look at it. Capacitances set things up, but you still need inductances to materialize what you've set up. So all you've really set up with capacitances is the potential for overunity. But you don't get the materialization of that, or the manifestation of that, the benefit of that, unless you include inductances as well. And that's why Eric Dollar's LMD module is so powerful, because in Paul Falstad's simulator, that's all you need. So long as it's his transformers and not using his other coils. And the transformer inductances have to be a certain minimum, and the capacitances on the capacitors have to be a certain minimum. If you get them up to a certain minimum in that configuration, the LMD module daisy-chained is great, so long as you don't short out the transformers like Eric tends to do. I do not. I never short. Well, no. In Paul Falstad's, I never short them out, but in Spice, Berkeley Spice, such as Microcap, they do have to be shorted out, but often I use a neon bulb to short them out on only one side. So if you get a daisy chain of 3 LMD modules, one side, I can't remember what I put across the short. It might be a capacitor. Yeah, it might be a capacitor, but on the other side, it's a neon bulb. It's a spark gap, because it works. But that's what's required. Oh, God, the waveform is so messy. It's just damn explosive. It's not nice like it is in Paul Falstad's simulator. But if that's how we build ideal transformers, is make them out of aluminum, hell, we can do whatever we want. We'll have free reign to do whatever we want. Because I did so many circuits that are over unity in Paul Falstad's simulator, all because of that property of his transformers being ideal, and not for any other reason. I mean, I think. I mean, it is so easy to do an over-unity circuit with an ideal transformer, as you can imagine, as any electrical engineer can imagine. But how do you build them? Anyway, enough said. I better shut up.